I'm Lee Moore.
And I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we are beginning a very short mini-series on a pair of poems. The two poems are both titled Water Dragon Chant, and they have different subtitles. The first poem is by a Song Dynasty poet named Zhang. The second poet is Sudongpo, also called Su She, and he is writing in response to Zhang. Over this week and the next week, we're going to be looking at these two poems and examining them and how they interact. Today, we're going to be looking at the poet Zhang, who is not particularly famous. He's from the Northern Song period. He was alive from 1027 to 1102, so very much in this time of political intrigue and infighting that the Northern Song was famous for. When I was looking up some information about Zhang, I didn't actually find all that much. I think he's just a less famous poet, certainly much less famous than Sudongpo. He was in fairly high positions in terms of politics, but he did not appear to take sides in the infighting between Sudongpo and Wang Anshi, which this period is famous for. We discussed that in previous episodes, so we're not going to go over that too much. But these fights were political knife fights. People got hurt. Sudongpo was sent down to Hainan. It was not like a beach town at the time.
I was about to say, now if you got sent down to Hainan, people would be like, sweet, I'll take that position.
But it was well known as this kind of, it was as backwater as you could get and still be in the Chinese Empire. And Sudongpo made the best of it, but no one at the time wanted to go down to Hainan. So Zhang, he's kind of a black box as far as we know. There's not too much information that we were able to find out about him, other than that he did become a Zhuren scholar, and Zhuren is, of course, the sort of high point of Chinese imperial scholarship / bureaucracy.
I'll introduce the two poems simply by saying that I came across them when in my translation work. I'm working on translating Wang Guowei's Renjian Si Hua, which is sort of poetry notes from the human world. It's an early 20th century book.
Rob, you're doing that for Oxford University Press, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Now that is Wang Guowei, puts the two poems side by side in the same little bit of commentary, which is pretty much the way you should do it, because Su Shi was very much inspired by Zhang and draws a lot of the same imagery from Zhang. However, they are very, very different poems, and that's kind of what
so different.
In fact, I'll give you a teaser, ladies and gentlemen, dear listeners. Make sure you tune into our next episode on Sudongpo, because I'll have a shocking admission to make. A shocking admission that ought to tease you into listening up. It's going to be exciting. Lee already knows what it is.
Rob doesn't actually speak Chinese.
I don't actually, exactly. I'm actually a Czech literature scholar. Wah, wah. Anyway, but the other thing is that we don't have a lot of biographical information on Zhang, but for the purpose of this discussion, it's not really that big a deal. What really matters here is the words on the page. And let's start talking about this poem. Now, I translated a very rough draft, a Chabuduo draft of this poem. I could read it. I'm a little embarrassed because I'm already looking at the page and I'm like, yikes. No, I probably shouldn't say that. But I suppose having some text is better than none.
If you could read it, let's go ahead and give the Chabuduo translation and just with the proviso, everybody, that this is very much a Chabuduo translation.
And if you're listening to this and we'll put the translation up on the website even. If you listen to it and you go, that is not how that line reads, please send us an email. That would be fantastic to have extra critics on this sucker. So anyway.
Yeah, that's a great reminder, Rob. We generally put poetry translations that we do up on the website associated with the episode. So go check out the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com.
So the title is variously Chant of the Water Dragon, Chant of the Water Primrose, I think is another one. Anyway, it belongs to a class of poems, believe it or not, that are chants about flowers, you have chants about willow catkins, chants about primroses, etc., etc. It's an actual genre of poetry. Anyway, so here's my Chabuduo translation. Swallows wheel, orioles idle, fragrant flowers spoil. On the embankment, willow catkins fall to the ground. Softly drifting or wildly dancing, they color the green of the forest, entirely without creative direction, just as Han Yu wrote. The willow's gossamer branches leisurely waft, and their catkins float into the innermost courtyard, where, as the days grow long, the main gate stays closed. Pearl curtains whip to and fro, and the catkins gently try to enter in. As before, they are aided on their way by the wind. Behind fragrant bed hangings, a lovely young woman sleeps, her sleeping gown covered in snow-white blossoms. The embroidered bed covering is gradually covered by countless fragrant pearls that now are round, but soon will break apart. Sometimes a bee appears, its body sticky with pollen, while fish make a ruckus in the pond. The young woman looks toward the distant houses of pleasure where a man loiters, and her eyes are filled with tears. Now, Lee, you and I have some very different readings of the poem. You came up with kind of a novel explanation for the logic of the poem, which is very interesting. I'll be interested to see if any of the readers agree, think we're crazy, you're crazy, whatever. It's not the reading I went with, and I'm still struggling a little bit with seeing how some of the lines come together. This is part of the peril of translating things yourself. But so just to set the stage for the problem here, so you've got long descriptions of these flowers, how they drift, how they color the green of the forest, etc., etc. They're drifting into the courtyard. You can kind of see a bit of allegory happening there. You're like, all right, fair enough, floating in the inmost courtyard. Okay, some kind of symbol of intimacy, perhaps. Then it gets a little bit creepy, because now they're floating into a woman's bedchamber, floating past the curtains, floating onto her body. And then suddenly we get imagery about bees and fish, etc. Now, that's where my understanding of the poem hits a speed bump, and yours hits the gas, apparently. So let's hear what you have.
Yeah, so Rob, the thing about these poems is you have two halves, and if you go onto the website and check out Rob's translation, and I'm going to put my translation up as well, you have to have, these aren't randomly juxtaposed, they have to be connected somehow. So as I was struggling to figure out how these two halves of the poem, one about flowers falling down, and then one about a woman who ends up crying at the end, how are they connected? I mean, obviously they're connected because the flowers are drifting into the woman's bedroom, but there's something almost sexual about the way the flowers are described. Now, follow my logic. You have a narrator who is located outside of this woman's bedroom, and slowly the point of view of the poem follows the flowers into the bedroom. And then we see these kind of almost liquidy drops of flowers just scattered all over her body. There's something sperm-like about this description. I mean, you have it almost as if these flowers are falling on her body, and it talks about them becoming round but about to break, as if they're drops of some sort of liquid. You have all of this imagery of this pearls, of pearls kind of dominating this discussion. I don't think it's going too far to say he's talking about something that's pretty nasty. Now, none of the commentary suggests this, and I am just kind of pulling this out of my dark side of
out
the
of your
moon.
hat,
out of my hat,
like a magician. That's what you meant to say.
But I am a literature scholar, so I'm supposed to be doing this. I don't think this is going that far. I mean, how else? So in the second half of the poem, we have this bee who's kind of buzzing around. He doesn't sting her, but we all know that bees have stingers. We all know that stingers are resemble something else. We have this fish who's swimming around, and it's kind of, if you don't interpret this sexually, I don't know where this fish is coming from. The fish is kind of just somewhere kind of making a racket. Now, a fish is a long thing that hangs out in water. I don't think it's too far to read the fish as a kind of phallic symbol, including, and I'm gonna reference something, Rob, we many moons ago did a podcast on the Xiaobu, which is the addendum to the Journey to the West, which is completely, totally different from the Journey to the West, but it has in that story, and I'll try and link to that podcast on the webpage, but in that story, you have a fish who represents desire. And remember, the Chinese for fish is a homophone for desire. Now, more frequently, fish is a symbol of a plenitude. We're just passing Chinese New Year's as we're recording this, but it frequently is used to symbolize that, you serve a fish during the new year because you want to have lots of money in the coming year. But it also sometimes in Chinese literature does symbolize desire. So you have this fish, maybe it's a symbol of phallic desire, and at the end of the poem, it's really hard to figure out if you don't interpret this in a kind of nasty, dirty way, and that's where my mind goes first, I'll admit. But if you don't interpret it in the sort of nasty, sexual way, then Rob, how do you interpret what's going on at the end? Because you have this woman who gets all of these white pearlish blossoms scattered upon her skin, and then she goes out and looks out the window and sees a man hanging out in the red light district. He's hanging out with hookers, and the poem just says he's kind of loafing around, not doing anything. I think the way to interpret this poem is that man is the guy who is kind of looking in to her bedroom, and the poem doesn't indicate that, but I think that that's a reasonable way to interpret it. And you have this kind of I'm gonna allude to James Joyce, as we have
that
frequently
settles
done
it. James Joyce is definitely the go-to authority on Song Dynasty poetry.
But you have this kind of similar to in the Nausicaa episode of Ulysses, where Leopold Bloom, where we're having a narration from Gertie's perspective, and Gertie is just a teenage girl who's kind of showing her knickers off to this man, and then he's throughout the episode he's masturbating to her, showing him her innermost parts. I think there's something similar. There's a similar kind of dynamic going on in this poem. It's a bit of a wild reading, I'll give you that. And Rob, you're nodding your head. Yes, this is crazy, Lee. But I think it's hard to figure out how to interpret this poem otherwise. Rob, really quickly, before we continue discussing my translation, I think I'll just read my translation. The oriole busies about, the eagle sits lazily, the fragrance lingers. Right on top of the dike, the willow flowers blow away. They lightly fly in every which way, speckling the green forest, completely lacking in spirit to get into a beauty contest. Lazily pursuing the earlier petals, looking like dancing strands of silk, they quietly approach the inner yard. The day is long, the gate is closed. They spread higgledy-piggledy beside the pearl bead bed curtain, gradually penetrating her bed, as before, pushed in by the wind. Through the curtains the beauty sleeps, of course, the white stuff covers her spring clothes. The brocade bed gradually fills up with the numberless aromatic beads. Still round, about to burst, then she sees a bee. It raises its head and drills the pollen. There is a fish flailing around. She looks out towards the quiet on the strip with all the whores. The rich guy is just hanging out, and her eyes brim with tears.
I don't think you're entirely crazy, but you are a huge lover of every word being a symbol of something else, or possibly being a symbol of something else. Can't be a fish. It's got to be a penis. Couldn't just be a fish. Now, it is true that
don't
a lot
they teach you that in comp lit departments, Rob? Isn't that what you're taught to do?
No, we don't deal a lot with purely arbitrary symbol assignations. We're like, I know it looks like a coat, but it's not really a coat. It's human innocence. Okay. Anyway, now there's a reference in here to Hanyu. Well, there's not a reference in the original language of the poem, but the commentaries all point out that there's a line which reads 全无才似, which is referencing another writer named Hanyu, who effectively said, if you're going to write poetry about natural stuff, don't write it about basically the kind of flowers this poem is about, because they're entirely without inspiration. They're totally useless things. You should write about bigger stuff. So that means that the subject matter of the poem is a flower that effectively no one thinks should be written about. It should be forgotten about, much as the young woman in her bed in the second stanza, right? So the entire first stanza is dealing with something that has been left behind, entirely forgotten about by poets and writers and artists and everything else.
Just as the woman has been forgotten about by a man who's hanging out with prostitutes.
Exactly. So one of the ways that I read this connection is, so you have these flowers, the forgotten about flowers, drifting into the bedroom. Now, we're going to talk about this more when we get to Su Shi's treatment of the subject, but Zhang Jie's poem is not the greatest poem. It's not bad. I say that judging a Song Dynasty poet, as someone who doesn't publish poetry. But anyway, whatever.
There's a reason he's not as famous as Su Dongpo.
Yes, there's a reason he's not as famous as Su Shi or Su Dongpo. We'll talk about that in the next episode. There are some clumsy connections here, and the way I read this is, it's like the poet wrote these descriptions of these forgotten flowers, and knowing that they're presented in the poetic tradition as being pointless and useless, feels like, look, I got to make this connection clear. So he sends them directly into the woman who is supposed to be connected to them, right? It's like he's showing the poets or the people reading this, look, see, the woman too, she got forgotten about. That's what these flowers are there for, It's not a particularly subtle connection, which would help explain why the flowers are there. And then, of course, the last line being the young woman. She's looking not at the man is. I don't know if we clarified this. The man is like not outside. He's somewhere else in a brothel or some red light district. She's been forgotten about. There's also a sense of maybe even possibly friendship between, not actual friendship, but a connection between the flowers and the young woman. I'm not entirely sure what to do with the bee, but that's also an example of my needing to do a little more scholarship, because most of these images have long histories in Chinese poetry. Zhang Jie didn't just suddenly go, hey, a bee, that would be really cool. They're highly referential. The line I mentioned above, the 全无彩色, is a direct quote from Han Yu. It's highly referential, and I don't know all the references, so that is A, part of our problem. And B, we're working off of partly my translation, which is a Chabuduo translation, and I could be dead wrong about some of these lines.
I looked over your translation before we did this, and I started working on my own translation, and I actually think your Chabuduo translation is pretty good. I would pick at it around the edges, but it's pretty decent. I agree with you. So these, especially Song Dynasty poetry, is very referential. It's elusive with an A. Everything is a reference to something else. I think that, though, that's more true of famous Song Dynasty poets than it is of people like Zhang Jie. And I think I suspect, I have no evidence for this, but I suspect one of the reasons Zhang Jie is not as famous and is not as well liked is because he wasn't as elusive as Su Dongpo. Because Su Dongpo, everything he's doing is a reference to something else, and you have to be so well educated and so deep in not only the classics but Tang Dynasty poetry and earlier Song Dynasty poetry to get all of these reference that it's almost the writing of poetry is an academic exercise. And what makes Su Dongpo so dang good is that he does that kind of academic elusiveness so effortlessly that it doesn't feel like he's trying.
Yeah.
That's his genius.
And I want to, we got to start wrapping this up, but I wanted to ask you, your reading is this incredibly sexual reading as a way of trying to make the lines work together. Can
we just call my reading the skeet, skeet, skeet like a water hose?
I'm fine. Let's call it that. The the milkshake version.
Our European listeners will have to Google that on Urban Dictionary. Skeet.
Yeah. I'm betting about a lot of people are going to have to Google that one. Or maybe they just don't care enough to Google it. I wouldn't blame you either if you listen to that line. You're like, I don't care. Just get back to the poem. Just stop being cool and just show us how not smart you are. All right. So you've got this incredibly the skeet, skeet, skeet reading. Got it. The way I was reading it a minute ago was that the poem exists partly as an exercise in bringing into the light an image, a subject that typically gets treated as second class. And you have a poet going, no, it's not second class. Look what we can do with it, right? So partly the poem exists to point us towards the flower, not necessarily away from it, both to and from away, because of course it is also meant to point us to this young woman who's been forgotten and left alone. Now, your sexual reading, what does that do for the flower? Does it give us anything new on the flower, or is it just meant to be dirty with no other real purpose besides just being dirty?
You say that like dirtiness is a problem, but I mean, when you look at if you look at some of Li Xiangying's poetry, Li Xiangying is a famous Tang Dynasty poet. He actually, and during the Song Dynasty and during the Tang, he was kind of so sexual as to be almost taboo. A lot of people wouldn't touch him. In the Song Dynasty, there is a kind of effort made to rehabilitate him, but these poets were oftentimes nasty, right? Like there is, in especially the later Confucian tradition, I'm thinking of like post Zhu, there is this kind of need to cut out all of the sexualization in earlier Chinese poetry. There are lots of very sexualized poems in the Shi Jing, the first collection of poetry in Chinese literature that have just kind of been explained away. Oh, this is not actually about this nasty thing, when it clearly is about sex. So I don't actually see any problem with having it just about the kind of nasty aspect. I mean, these are love poems. They are poems. I mean, he's alluding to prostitution here. I don't know that I accept the legitimacy of your question.
So then what do you do with the first stanza? Your reading takes puts all the weight of the entire poem on the second stanza and basically says the first stanza, it's like coloring your scenery. Let's move on, right? The old stanza doesn't even exist. What do you do with swallow's wheel, oriole's idle, fragrant flowers spoil, the willow's gossamer branch? You just basically erase all those and go, the real stuff, the money, yes, the money shot is in the second stanza.
The money shot in this poem?
Just forget about the first stanza. Yes, I just did say that.
Did you just say the money shot in this poem?
I sure did.
Use the word swallows?
Oh, see, no, that wasn't where I was going. They're not going to let us air this episode.
Rob, I think that the first stanza actually is incredibly good at kind of explaining what the second stanza is doing. All poems about flowers are actually about beautiful women in Chinese tradition. I mean, not all, but most poems about flowers. I mean, if you think about there's a collection or a Ming Dynasty novel about it's called Jinghua Yuan, and that's about flowers that fall to the earth as women and take over, and kind of it's this kind of gender bending novel. Everything in Chinese tradition, when you're talking about flowers, you're actually talking about women. I mean, it seems odd to me for you to suggest that this first stanza needs to be kind of independent.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you make it independent. You're saying the second stanza, you've got this extensively extensively thought out anyway, interpretation, and you didn't even talk about the first stanza. Like, is it just there to describe flowers as a kind of scene setter, and that's all it is? And then we just move directly to...
It's a mirror image of what's going on with the woman.
How so?
I would say. I mean, these flowers are kind of left, they're not discussed poetically. I think your interpretation of the first stanza is spot on.
So they're left behind, they're forgotten. Then we get to the second one where she's completely covered in semen. How in the world do you make that work?
Flowers, semen, flower. Yeah.
Right, but I mean, how do you make it work? Like, she's forgotten, and that's why she's basically being peeped on and covered in fluids. Like, how in the world does that connect?
I don't see how it doesn't connect. She's being covered by the fluids from the flowers, the fluids that are the flowers.
Right, but how does that... The flowers are being forgotten, and therefore... Like, I don't
she is also being forgotten.
And that's why she has to be covered by them. Well, see, that's what I'm saying is the connection being, they're both being forgotten about, I'm down with. But then all of a sudden, they're forgotten about, but they're also human bodily fluids.
Yeah. It's a poem, Rob. It can mean two different things. That's kind of how symbolism works.
That's why symbolism is so it can be so tricky to discuss, because it's purely a look, man. This is how I read it, and I'm like, okay.
I know your training doesn't equip you to discuss symbolism because you only have a PhD from comparative literature, but it is actually an important thing in literature
if it's well set up. And not just the Lee Moore 2022 reading forgetting thousands of years of commentary that don't even recognize it exists. Then yes, I will discuss it. In the meantime, you know what? We're actually really getting into the weeds, I think. I hope people have listened to us this far.
Getting into the weeds in many ways.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're still with us, this should give you an indication of how graduate seminars in literature work. We can do this for hours. It's actually a lot of fun, but I hope you thought it was fun.
I hope y'all enjoyed my reading, and next week we'll discuss Sudongpo's response to Zhang Jie's poem. We'll put the translations, any translations that we do, on the website. Rob, if they want to check us out on social media, where should folks go?
Well, springing as it does from your discussion about sexuality, checking us out maybe isn't the best phrase, because if you were going to check people out for their attractiveness, etc., that would not be us. We're not.
We
the
have
people
faces made for podcast history.
Absolutely. You'll notice if you go to our Twitter feed, not a lot of pictures of us in the feed. That's for good reason. Anyway, we do have a Twitter feed. It's Chinlit Pod. We're on Instagram. You can find us there. Chinese Lit Pod, as in Chinese Literature Podcast, obviously. Chinese Literature Podcast at Gmail, and of course, Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.